Hello, this is Dr. James Strickler, and this is a course in the United States history. This lecture addresses Chapter 20, the Progressive Era, in the United States history textbook, American Yawp. The first thing to do in this chapter is to define what we mean by the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era was a period in American politics following the Gilded Age, in which the people, and politicians therefore, expressed a dissatisfaction with what they considered to be the excesses of the Gilded Age, when income and wealth became very disparate in the country, where the difference between the rich and poor seemed greater than ever. This led to a series of reform movements in which the attempt was made to use the power of government to make society more fair in the view of the reformers. That is what the Progressive Era was. The first topic to address as we discuss the Progressive Era is why people mobilize for reform. What things did they see going on that troubled them? A particular example can be used to illustrate the concerns that people had about how businesses conducted themselves, which then caused them to want government to intervene. This particular event is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. A shirtwaist was a women's garment that was popularly worn during this time period. It was a blouse that was cinched at the waist. This factory had many women employed in it, over 200 in a given shift, who would sew these shirtwaist garments. A year prior to the factory fire, the workers had attempted to go on strike, demanding higher wages and better safety conditions. But they had lost their attempt. They had been forced to go back to work. The factory owners and managers then had a problem that they decided to address in an unsafe way. The concern was that women would slip away from their sewing machines to go outside to take breaks. By going outside, they could avoid being seen not working. The factory operators decided to deal with this problem by chaining all the exit doors shut, so that the women could not escape out and be unseen. What happened was that when the fire broke out, there was no way to get out because of the chained doors, except through one exit that the management had been monitoring, and not everyone could get out through that exit quickly enough. The result was that almost 150 women died in the fire, and another 70 were injured. This was a disaster that got national headlines, and it demonstrated the callous ways that businesses would go about extracting as much labor as possible from their employees, how they put profits ahead of life potentially. It was events such as this that swung the opinion of politicians and much of the public against what they considered to be businesses engaging in inappropriate means to maximize their profits. This then led to the publicizing of these sorts of problems by journalists and authors. Those sorts of people who publicized the practices of corruption and the poverty that was created by it, by the conduct of businesses, became known as muckrakers. This is a term that was used by Teddy Roosevelt, the most prominent politician of this time period. He referred to the fact that in a meatpacking plant, there were lots of little scraps, bits of animal carcasses that would end up on the floor. And someone had a job to go through the day with a rake and clear them out of the way so that the production could continue uninterrupted. That person who would clear the refuse off the floor was called a muckraker. Teddy Roosevelt likened the journalists exposing the corruption of business to being similar to that of the muckrakers in the meat plant. They were raking away the bad stuff off of the floor, getting it out of the way so business could be properly conducted. They were just exposing the worst practices so they could be cleaned up. That was his vision of the muckrakers. An example of a muckraker was an author and journalist, Jacob Riis, who wrote a book titled How the Other Half Lives, where he went among the slums and tenements in New York City and described how the people lived at the bottom of the economic ladder. He also took photographs that were published in his book. This was for many people in the middle and upper class who read his book, their first exposure to what life was like at the bottom. This caused them to think that maybe society bore some responsibility for this, and it led to housing reforms in New York City. Now we can debate whether or not those reforms actually made sense, because what they did was they ended up setting maximum prices that people could charge for rent. The idea was that to make housing more affordable, so that these people at the bottom of the economic ladder wouldn't have to pile up 10 people in a room to sleep. Instead, they could spread out into better living conditions. But this kind of reform actually has negative consequences. When you limit the profits that the people who own the housing can make, then they have less incentive to create housing. And you actually end up with exacerbated housing shortages. But nonetheless, whether it's a smart reform or not, the point is that his book inspired the reform. It showed how muckrakers could cause actual change in society by exposing these ills that they perceived. Another example of this is The Jungle, probably the most famous book from this era written by a social activist. The man was Upton Sinclair. He was an author that decided to write a book about immigrants coming to America and getting jobs in the meatpacking industry. Upton Sinclair was a socialist who hoped that his book would inspire enough sympathy for the lower classes to eventually cause a socialist revolution in America, that America would in effect become a communist country. While his book didn't accomplish that purpose, it did have a profound effect, because he described in detail the process by which meat was processed in these factories. And the process so disgusted the people that read the book that they demanded change to clean it up and make it more safe. That change came in the form of the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. These were laws that were passed to make sure that conditions in meat processing plants would be sanitary, and which banned the sale across state lines of any contaminated or mislabeled food or drug products. What you see on this slide is an example of an advertisement put out by a company in the newspaper saying that they had never done things in violation of this act. They were doing the business right before the act came into effect, so people should come and buy from them. This shows the effect that the act had. As people realized how bad conditions were, they wanted to know that things were done cleanly and safely, and they decided that having the government impose rules was the way to accomplish this. Another example of an influential piece of literature from this era was a book written by Edward Bellamy called Looking Backward. In this book, he imagined that a man fell asleep in Boston in 1887. He published the book in 1888. And the man woke in the year 2000 to discover a utopian society where everyone lived in harmony and economic prosperity. And he imagined that we had got there because businesses had realized that they needed to help people and work together to build a better future. This was an imaginative vision of the future, but it was one that people thought could possibly come true if they could just get businesses to behave, to marshal the inventions that they were creating, to marshal the systems that they were managing for the good of everyone, rather than just to line the pocketbooks of the rich owners. During this time period, religion also came into play. An example of this is the Kingdom of God that was promoted by Walter Rauschenbusch. As Walter Rauschenbusch examined the teachings of the Bible, and he read about Jesus saying that he was there to bring the kingdom of God, Rauschenbusch framed this as using society to help the poor and the needy, to create a more heavenly place on earth, that we should marshal the resources of society to help those in need. This became known as the social gospel. It was an outward-looking vision of Christianity. It wasn't so much about you changing your own heart to become more in alignment with what God wanted. It was about you changing the world around you to make it a more heavenly place. You would do this by going out and helping and serving the poor. Another thing that happened during this progressive era was the influence and actions of women. Women had already developed a system of social clubs, particularly among the middle and upper class, where they would get together to discuss ways that they could improve themselves. This might be through them learning how to be better homemakers or developing their intellectual skills by reading books together, things like that. But eventually these women's clubs started to turn outward, to look for ways that they could change society, not just change themselves. And to accomplish this, they began to organize together in larger federations. So instead of just a few women in a neighborhood who gathered together to discuss how they could improve their lives, they'd be part of a nationwide system potentially, where women could mobilize together to make the world a better place. An example of how they organized together was the General Federation of Women's Clubs, which had chapters spread in many states, allowing women to organize together to improve society. Some women took advantage of their place in society as an opportunity to act as moral vigilantes. A vigilante is a person who takes the law in their own hands to decide to enforce morality on society by force. An example of this is Carrie A. Nation. She was a motherly looking person, even grandmotherly looking person, and she realized that she could walk in places and do things that others couldn't. If she was just bold, she could get away with much. No one was going to attack a woman. So she would walk into a saloon, a place that served alcohol, with a hatchet and just break the place up, destroy all the booze and the kegs of beer. She did this because she thought alcohol was an evil upon society, and it was her place to go destroy it if she could. This was a pretty radical action for a woman during this time period, but it shows just how far some women thought that they could press their ability and their obligation, they thought, to make society better. A more moderate view on the same subject came from the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This was an organization of women who thought that it was wrong for people to be drinking alcohol. They saw it as a root of many evils in society. Alcohol was cheap and abundant. Men would come home from a hard day of work and they would drink to excess. Then they wouldn't be helpful around the house, and even worse, they might beat their wives and children as alcohol took down their inhibitions. So to try to eliminate alcohol, women organized together in groups like this, in which they fought for the adoption of policies in society that would reduce the influence of alcohol. They might even do this by themselves pledging to never drink alcohol, such as this card that you see on this page, and trying to get others to do so, such as the men in their lives. Another example of how women might try to change society was a system of settlement houses that were created across the country during this time period. Settlement houses were large homes that were established in poor neighborhoods, where rich and middle class people might come to live, to try to share their expertise and wisdom with the local poor people. This was an idea that was gathered by a woman named Jane Addams as she toured Europe and saw similar things there. She helped establish the Hull House in Chicago in 1914, but her idea spread to other communities. Now it's questionable how successful this really was, whether it was just a vanity project for the people that went there, who really relocated to live there. Yes, they obviously helped a few people along the way who came and sought their advice and assistance, but did they really change the neighborhoods that they were in? That's questionable. But nonetheless, there was a moral value to this effort. These people were trying to do good, and this showed some of the sentiment of this age. It was an age of progress and reform, where people were trying to correct the ills in society. Now, whether they were always successful or not is another question. But this was the feeling of the era, to do something. Jane Addams, who helped start the settlement house movement, was an idealist. She particularly was concerned about the needs of the poor. And when she looked around at some of the things that government did, she thought that their resources could be used better, particularly as she looked at war, which she saw as just an unmitigated waste of the resources of society. She advocated that there should be a universal peace, that people should turn away from war making so that those resources could be used for the good of society. She was one of the first people to outline here in the United States ideals of pacifism, where people would refuse to fight and thus reduce the possibility of gathering enough troops and resources to fight with, thus eliminating war, she hoped. She eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931 for her efforts. But again, idealism doesn't always change the world. It shows where her sentiments were. I'm sure it changed many people's hearts, but it did not eliminate war. Another big thing that women were concerned about during this time period was suffrage, which is another word for the right to vote. Many Western states had already by this time period granted women the right to vote. The first of these was Wyoming, followed by Utah in the mid to late 1800s. Others followed after. But the eastern states were reluctant to give women the right to vote. And there's a reason for this. Women voting changes politics dramatically. Historically, women have been much more sympathetic to the needs of others than men are. So men running the government makes the government more harsh. Now, sometimes that means more efficient, yes, but it also means that it comes across as less caring. So if you're a reformist and you want to change America for the better by taking care of the poor and the needy, you need more votes to do that if you're going to use the power of government. And you can get more votes to do that by getting women to vote. So there were two reasons behind the women's suffrage movement. One was just merely the moral idea that women should vote if men can, an equality issue. The other was a practical political issue of getting women voters out there so that progressive laws could get passed. A national association formed around this, the National American Suffrage Association it was called. This is a way by which women all over the country could coordinate their efforts together to try to bring pressure to bear to get the right to vote. They would hold demonstrations and protests and marches, but they were all very peaceful for the most part. They were confrontational in the sense that they were raising an uncomfortable issue, but they didn't push things too hard. This was, in a sense, a conservative organization trying to press a progressive cause. But other women approached the issue more radically. An example of this was a woman named Alice Paul, who organized something called the National Women's Party. The National Women's Party demanded that women get the right to vote. And they went so far as organizing a protest, a picket outside the White House, where they surrounded its fence, tried to stay there and not let other people in and out. As much as 150 women in her movement ended up being arrested for this action around the White House, as White House security tried to move them out of the way, as they inhibited the operation of the White House, and they refused to move, and ended up being arrested for it. These sorts of pressures, both moderate and radical, eventually led to the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote in 1920. No longer could the right to vote be denied on account of sex within the United States of America. The next topic in this chapter is the targeting of trusts. Now, as I discuss the targeting of trusts, you need to understand that we're talking about something that we have discussed before in other chapters, just now by a different name. A trust can be thought of as a monopoly or a cartel. They're all slightly different versions of the same thing. They are all based around the idea that one entity controls an entire segment of the economy. The most classic example of this from this time period is Standard Oil, owned by John Rockefeller. Standard Oil controlled the entire oil and gasoline industry within the United States. That made it a monopoly, owned by a single man, John Rockefeller. I should say controlled by him, singularly. Now, there are other ways to do this, though. A cartel is a small group of businesses that coordinate together to control an entire segment of the economy, rather than a single business. But by them cooperating together, the result is the same for the consumer at the bottom. The problem with a monopoly is that when one business controls everything, they can do whatever they want. If you control all the oil and gasoline in the country, you can choose to charge $2 for it or $10 for it. and the consumer has no choice other than to just buy it. There's no competitor to go to. Well, a cartel can accomplish the same thing for a small group of owners. They can coordinate together to charge $10 a gallon for gas. A trust is a slightly different thing. This is where, instead of the people trying to directly own the companies, instead what they do is they try to get majority control in a legal entity called a trust that controls the companies. So they would set up a trust. The people would buy into the trust. The trust would then buy stock in various companies until they had a majority in each company needed to control that industry. The owners of that trust would then claim, well, we don't have a monopoly. We just own parts of this trust, and it just owns parts of companies. Now, if that ends up making that in the end that there's total control of that industry, well, that's not really our fault. We aren't the owners of it. The trust is. So it's a legal maneuver to try to avoid responsibility. But in the end, it creates the same situation. There's one person or one small group of people that controls an entire industry and a segment of industry and can profit off of it. This was made possible in this era because leading up to the progressive era, there was what we call a laissez-faire approach to economic policy in the United States. What is meant by that is that the government keeps its hands off the economy. There was this feeling that the economy would operate best without government interference, as companies competed with each other to provide the best services and products at the lowest price. Now we get into trouble with this when monopolies form, that then get rid of this competitive spirit. But that was the approach that was generally taken during our country's history. Stay out of the way of business, let it do what it wants, and that will be the most efficient way, the most beneficial way that it can operate for everyone. An example can be seen in this picture here, where cocaine was routinely marketed as a way to deal with toothache pain. Another example was morphine was routinely marketed during this time period as something to give your children to calm them down at night to go to sleep. It shows just how much the government stayed out of the economy. Substances that we would consider to be dangerous drugs today were freely bought and sold, to be given to children even. But that idea of just staying out of the way of the economy had problems as monopolies formed. And the monopolies that formed tried to integrate their control over a segment of the economy two ways. One is called vertical integration, where they might own the entire process from the raw resource being extracted to the final product being sold to consumers. You can see that in the diagram on the left-hand side of this page, where you might have a meat packing monopoly that owns the cows, owns the railroad cars, owns the meat processing plants, owns the stores to sell the meat, etc. They control the entire process from beginning to end, and therefore can control the prices from beginning to end. Another kind of monopolistic integration is horizontal, where one company controls all the companies that do that sort of thing, so that there are no competitors. The would-be competitors are owned by them. An ideal monopoly is both vertically and horizontally integrated. There's no way for anybody to compete with it at any stage in the process. Farmers were opposed to these monopolies, particularly railroad monopolies, and they began to organize together in what became known as the Granger movement. Farmers cooperated together to put pressure on governments, particularly local governments, state governments, to pass laws to make it easier for them to do business. A big issue they had was that the railroads knew when crops were going to be harvested and when the farmers therefore needed to get their crops to market. The railroads could then raise their prices during those time periods, and the farmers just simply had to pay the higher prices. The farmers didn't like this. Now, it makes obvious economic sense from the point of view of the railroads. When there's greater demand, you can raise the prices for things, and there's going to be greater demand when the farmers all want to ship their stuff. So the Grangers, to control the prices, got the governments of their states to step in and regulate those prices, not just for the railroads, but for the storage facilities called grain elevators that operated near the railroads. Farmers would harvest crops and then they would deposit them in the grain elevators to wait until they thought that there were appropriate prices for them to sell them. When the price for grain went up, then they would tell the railroads, we're ready to ship. Unload the grain elevators onto the rail cars and get it moving to market. Well, they had to pay storage fees for the grain elevators too. But again, the grain elevator operators knew what was happening. They would raise the prices when the farmers were ready to stock up a bunch of crops in the elevators. The farmers didn't like being taken advantage of, and so they got the power of government to step in to regulate the prices for them. Eventually, the Supreme Court declared this to be inappropriate, that if there were going to be laws that regulated the prices of railroads and grain elevators that were involved in commerce and moving among the states, that would have to be done by the federal government. And the federal government stepped in to do this. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act was passed, creating the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Interstate Commerce Commission would impose rules on things like railroads and grain elevators in order to limit their ability to price gouge, as they called it. Price gouging is when you see somebody in a desperate situation and you can supply what they need, but you jack the prices way up in order to provide it. Some people consider this unfair because something that they could have went to the store and bought for $2 one day, the next day when they're desperate for it, they then have to pay $20. But there's another side to this, and that is that when businesses can maximize their profits from situations like that, then people come in to supply the needed goods. An example of that could happen is, let's say that there's a hurricane in another state, and a bunch of people have lost their power, and consumers there are desperate for generators. And you look in your local store and say, there's a bunch of generators for sale here. I could buy them all, put them in the back of my truck, I could drive to that other state, and I could sell them for 4 times the price and make a nice profit. That's called price gouging. Some people consider it to be immoral and wrong. But the other side of it is, if you can't make a big profit like that, you're not going to bother to buy the generators and put them in your truck and drive them to the other state. So while the people in that state that are desperate for generators won't get price gouged because it's illegal to do it, they also won't have you showing up with the extra generators they need. So there are two sides to this argument. But in this case, in this coming progressive era, the government is moving toward the idea of using its power to impose what they consider to be fairness. Perhaps the biggest example of a law passed during this time period to fight against the power of business was the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was a law that made it illegal for monopolies and trusts and cartels to cooperate together to maximize their profits by controlling the entire market. You can see in the background of this picture Teddy Roosevelt snickering as a government regulator cracks down on a trust to get the money back out of it that it was hoarding from the people. This law ends up becoming a powerful tool that can be used by politicians to fight against monopolies and trusts. Teddy Roosevelt, who you saw in the background of the other picture, who was the most prominent politician of this time period, became known for the practice of trust busting. This is where the government moves in and uses its power to try to break up monopolies. The most famous example of this was the eventual breakup of Standard Oil. The government came in and brought a lawsuit against it as a trust. They won in court, as a monopoly. They won in court, and Standard Oil was broken up into about a dozen different smaller oil companies. The owner of Standard Oil, Rockefeller, was forced to actually sell off parts of his businesses to other people so that they could create companies to compete with his. This is the kind of thing that trust busting would do. An early example of successful trust busting came in 1904, when the government successfully sued in court and won and broke up the Northern Securities Company. This was a trust that had been established to gain control of all the railroads in the northwestern United States. The owners of it were people like J.P. Morgan, the famous banker. They each owned a bit of the trust, and then the trust owned a bit of each company, until it had control of each of the companies, which allowed it to control the entire network of railroads, and therefore set whatever prices and maximize whatever profits they could for the holders of the trust company. Well, the government successfully sued, argued that it really was a monopoly, and had it broken up in 1904. In 1906, the Hepburn Act was passed. This was a law that was designed to regulate the best practices of railroads. They would set what rates railroads could charge for their businesses and how they had to conduct themselves as businesses. This is centralized planning, centralized pricing. Now, while it does have the benefit of they can stop these companies from charging exorbitant amounts that some customers are then unable to pay, it has the bad side of creating inefficiencies in the market. Now companies are required to operate at rates that maybe they can't turn a profit from. This then leads people to not enter that market, to create more businesses, as we discussed before when I talked about housing as an example. But nonetheless, as I've said already, this was the feeling of the era. The businesses are taking advantage of people. We need the government to step in and tell them what they can and can't do. In this case, telling the railroads what they are allowed to charge. Teddy Roosevelt, as the most prominent politician in this era, is known rightly as the Great Trust Buster. But in some senses, he really wasn't. After serving 2 terms in office, he left the presidency, following the example of George Washington, who'd only served 2 terms. And he told people to then vote for William Howard Taft, who he thought would carry on his legacy. And Roosevelt was so popular that Taft was able to ride Roosevelt's popularity to then win the presidency himself in 1908. And he did continue Teddy Roosevelt's practices. He busted twice as many trusts during his time in office as Roosevelt had done with his. But that wasn't good enough for Teddy Roosevelt. By 1912, Teddy Roosevelt had the itch to be president again. But the problem is that he was a Republican. And the Republican Party already had a president, William Howard Taft, who was running for re-election. So Teddy Roosevelt decided to form his own third party, the Progressive Party it was called. It was popularly known as the Bull Moose Party, because Teddy Roosevelt was sometimes referred to as a bull moose for the way he behaved, his just aggressive conduct. Well, the Bull Moose Party ended up having a great effect on the election in 1912. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt got more votes than Howard Taft, the President of the United States. The problem is that they split the votes on their side, leading to the election of Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat. As Teddy Roosevelt was running for president in 1912, he described his view of what America should do as new nationalism. Now, what he meant by this was that the government should be ever more aggressive in expanding its power to protect people from exploitation, to provide for their welfare. He particularly wanted this power concentrated in the executive branch of government. Up to this point, the laws that had been passed to fight the excesses of businesses have been designed to allow people to sue, go to the courts, and get relief. This left the power to regulate the businesses effectively in the courts. They could decide whether or not how the businesses were behaving was appropriate or not. Teddy Roosevelt wanted that power in the executive branch, so that when he became president, he could control it. He could decide whether business was acting appropriately, and then he could bring the hammer down on them if they were not, rather than the courts. Woodrow Wilson had a different vision of how to deal with the excesses of business, how to bring more progressive policies to America. Now, you got to understand that they were both progressives, along with Taft. Every candidate in 1912 was a progressive. The only question was to what degree and in what ways did they want to use the power of government to help the underclass. Woodrow Wilson's vision was influenced by Thomas Jefferson. You may remember from an earlier U.S. history course that Thomas Jefferson had a vision of America as a society of small farmers, each independent, not beholden to any other big, powerful interests. Woodrow Wilson wanted the same thing to happen in business. He imagined that the U.S. government could provide a system of assistance and incentives that would allow smaller businesses to compete with the big monopolies. This he called his New Freedom Agenda, and it attacked the problem from the other point of view. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to directly attack the monopolies and break them up. Woodrow Wilson wanted to encourage businesses at the bottom to grow and become competitors to the monopolies. In both cases, they wanted to get rid of the monopolies. Toward this end, when Woodrow Wilson became president, he actually governed in ways much similar to what Teddy Roosevelt had and what Teddy Roosevelt promised to do. An example of this is the creation of the Clayton Antitrust Act and its enforcement under Woodrow Wilson through the Federal Trade Commission. The Clayton Antitrust Act took the Sherman Act to a new level. It specifically regulated mergers and tried to avoid price discrimination and protect collective bargaining as employees might fight against the monopolies from within by going on strikes and demanding higher wages, things like that. This is a very progressive law to interfere with much of the conduct of business, and this was done with Woodrow Wilson as president. It shows that how probably no matter who was elected in 1912, the power of government would have increased. Its control over the economy would have been enhanced. It was not just the economy that progressives had their eye on as they tried to make the world a better place. They also tried to use the power of government to improve the natural world. There are two basic approaches to how this might be done. One we can call preservation, the other conservation. Preservation is when you spot a natural resource that you think should be preserved for future generations, and you simply put it off limit to business. An example of this is Yellowstone, the first national park created in the world in 1872. Other countries followed, and we now have national parks in various countries all over the planet. These are areas that are set aside where development is not supposed to happen. But there's another approach, conservation, where you actually make use of those natural resources, but you try to do it wisely in a way that will maximize its benefit for humanity. This means that sometimes you will limit how much it can be used because, for example, you don't want to fish a particular variety of fish to extinction. You want to keep it around for future generations to fish too. So you might limit the number of fish that can be taken, but you don't entirely stop fishing. So this is the difference between preservation and conservation. Preservation puts things off limits. Conservation tries to manage the use of things for human benefit. An example of this battle came in debate over whether or not to build a dam on the Hetchy Valley. The Hetchy Valley actually existed within, at that time, the boundaries of a national park, Yosemite National Park. But there was a need for water for the San Francisco Bay Area, where the population was growing dramatically. So they wanted to create a reservoir where the water could be stored during times in which there was much rain, to be used during times of drought. The Hetchy Valley was an ideal place, but some people wanted to preserve it for its natural beauty. Well, this then became a focal point of debate between the preservationists and the conservationists. Eventually, the conservationists won, and in 1913 a law was passed to dam the valley and flood it to provide a reservoir for San Francisco. One of the great advocates of preservation was a man named John Muir. He was a man who wrote poetry and prose about the beauty of nature. His books are still available today. Many people read them that love the natural world. He founded the Sierra Club in 1892, an organization to fight for preservation of the environment. He had an influence on politicians. You can see him in this photo standing near a giant sequoia tree in a national park. And beside him is Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States. So while he had an influence on society and led to things like the creation of national parks and preserved wilderness areas, he did not exactly win the day. On the other side were people like Gifford Pinchot, a founder of the United States Forest Service. He was very much a believer in conservation, that resources should be used to assist humanity. But someone needed to be wisely in charge of that use, a bureaucrat like him. Now again, we're back to the problem of sometimes the best intentions don't work out. In many cases, those natural resources have been mismanaged by government. A recent example of this could be seen in the fires that now seem to every season sweep through California. Those big fires are a result of the government preventing forest fires. Now you may say, what? How could that be a result? Forest fires are a natural part of the process of forests renewing themselves. Fires come through and sweep out the undergrowth. In some cases, they're required in order for the trees to release their seeds so that new generations of trees can grow. But if you are trying to preserve the wilderness exactly as it is, so that people can come in as hikers and campers and enjoy it, you don't want it devastated by fire. So you prevent the fires. As soon as you see a fire, you come in and you put it out. Well, then what happens is the tinder just builds up for years and years. And when a fire does finally get started and get going, it rages much more than it otherwise would. So this is an example of how sometimes conservation doesn't work out the way that you expect. There are unintended consequences. But nonetheless, this is an effort to make use of the forest in the way that is best for humanity, to put your thumb on the scales of nature and try to make it tilt in the way that humans need it to tilt. Now, an example of how destructive humanity can be if they do not carefully manage how they behave can be seen in the extinction of the North American passenger pigeon. It's believed that as many as 5 billion passenger pigeons lived in North America as the people of European descent started to spread across the continent. They were seen as an easily accessible resource. They were a popular dish. Pigeons were hunted for food. They were served in fancy restaurants in big cities. But they were also seen as a nuisance by farmers as vast flocks would come in. It was reported that sometimes it would take days for an entire flock to pass by an area. And they would fly in and they would land and they would eat crops. They were seen as a nuisance to be destroyed. So they were routinely killed, both for food and for pest elimination. And their numbers dwindled and dwindled and dwindled. And within decades, they went from billions to dying out completely. So, if we are going to have things in our environment to use in the future, while we may want to use them, we obviously have to be careful about how we do so. The death of the passenger pigeon, which the last one died in 1914 in a zoo, was seen ahead of time though. Their numbers had dwindled so much that people got concerned about what we were doing with birds. A problem also was that bird feathers, in fact entire bird carcasses, had become a fashion style. You can see women here around the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s wearing birds on their hats. This was such a popular fashion style that people became worried about that other birds would be driven to extinction too. The Audubon Society, another one of these organizations set up to preserve the environment, staged a campaign to try to get people to turn away from using bird feathers and carcasses in fashion. They eventually persuaded government to pass the Lacey Act, which banned the shipment of species killed illegally across state lines. What this meant was that, let's say that in the state of Missouri, they realized that a bird was endangered, so they passed a law to preserve it. Then you couldn't have people in New York, say, buying feathers from that bird. Now the reason this is important is, if people in New York still want to buy the feathers, then there's an incentive for people to go out and illegally kill the birds in Missouri. Well, the Lacey Act put a stop to that kind of thing, reducing the incentives for hunting birds and thus helping preserve their numbers. Another thing that was of great concern during the Progressive era was race relations. This was also the era of Jim Crow. Now, White men had long felt, as has been discussed in previous chapters, that they had a burden as the most civilized people upon the planet to carry that civilization to other peoples. This led to a feeling of racial superiority, that other people of other races needed to be taken care of because they couldn't take care of themselves. This had an effect on the conduct of Americans across racial lines. Now, you may recall that after the Civil War, during the period of Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment was passed to the Constitution, which ensured that the right to vote would not be discriminated on the basis of race. So in 1870, and therefore going on, anyone of any race who was a man, it would take till 1920 until women could vote also, but an adult male of any race as of 1870 should be able to cast a vote. But this brought up a problem. Many white people in the South resented the idea of blacks voting. They didn't think that they were capable of doing so, and so they wanted to prevent them regardless of the 15th Amendment. This led to a series of measures across the South that have been discussed in other chapters of this book that were designed to disenfranchise black voters. Franchise is a term used for the right to vote. So if you disenfranchise someone, you prevent them from using that right to vote. This was done through things such as poll taxes, where people had to pay to vote, or literacy tests, where they had to prove that they could read or write to vote. The idea was that the former slaves and the descendants of former slaves would be less likely to be able to do those things. Now, this might harm poor illiterate white people too. So you might pass a grandfather clause also that allowed people to vote if their grandfather had been able to vote. Now, obviously, if you're the son of a slave, your grandfather couldn't vote. But if you're just a poor white man that doesn't know how to read, well, your grandfather could vote, so you could. Another way to prevent black participation in politics was through all-white primaries. A primary is the way by which a political party chooses its candidates. This is a private affair done by the political party. In the South during this time period, basically you had to be a Democrat to win any election. This was a reaction to the Republicans being the enemies during the Civil War. Once the federal armies had withdrawn from the South after Reconstruction, then whites only wanted to be Democrats. The Republicans were the hated enemy. And there were enough whites that to win an election, you had to be a Democrat. Well, all the political party had to do was ensure that in their primary process, only white people could participate. This would ensure that all the candidates would be white people with proper attitudes. At that point, it didn't matter who the black voters might come in and try to vote for. Whoever they voted for, it would be the white Democrat who won. This is also a period where, in addition to voter suppression happening, segregation was also in place, or more commonly known as Jim Crow, a reference to a cartoonish character from the vaudeville era, where a man dressed up in blackface and did exaggerated things portraying a black man on stage for his audience to laugh at. Jim Crow was a system by which white and black people could not use the same facilities. There might be one drinking fountain for white people, another drinking fountain for, as they referred to as the time, colored people. There might be a restaurant that only served white people. There might be a swimming pool that was only open on certain days for white people and only open on certain days for black people. This was designed to keep the races separate. The feeling was, among the white majority, even if they might have to provide some sort of equal rights to blacks in certain ways, which they probably didn't, that didn't mean that they would have to actually associate with them. Now, the 14th Amendment, which had been added to the Constitution in 1868, seemed to directly forbid this kind of behavior. It included the Equal Protection Clause that said that states had to provide their citizens equal protection of the laws. But what exactly does this mean? What do the states have to do or not do to provide equal protection? In a famous series of cases in 1883 called the Civil Rights Cases, the United States Supreme Court determined that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause did not apply to the private behavior of business owners, for example. So while, for example, a government-owned restaurant might not be able to say whites only, a privately owned restaurant could. Well, this meant that much of the segregation in the South could easily continue because it was done by private businesses and private people, not by the government. But what about the government? Well, in a famous case in 1896, a man named Homer Plessy challenged the segregation of railroads in Louisiana. There was a law in Louisiana that required railroad companies to provide separate cars for blacks and whites. Homer Plessy was 1/8 black, which made him, under the laws at the time, a black man. There was this idea that if you had one drop of African blood, you were considered black. Now, no one would look at Homer Plessy and think he was black. So he was able to get on a white railroad car and then have it pointed out by a co-conspirator to the security guard on the railroad car, who was also part of the conspiracy, that he was a black man on the white railroad car. He was then forced off the railroad car, which gave him a cause of action to sue. His case ended up going all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and there the United States Supreme Court ruled that segregation was constitutional under the Equal Protection Clause, as long as the facilities provided were equal. So you could have a separate railroad car for whites and a separate railroad car for blacks, as long as the railroad cars were equivalent. Then they are not being treated unequally, is what the Supreme Court said. Now, entering this area of Jim Crow and segregation, even though the Supreme Court said that the segregation should be equal, it rarely, if ever, was. In fact, black citizens during this time period faced many obstacles toward being treated equally. Well, two prominent men rose up in the black community with different visions of how to fight the battle against segregation and unequal treatment. One was Booker T. Washington. He gave a famous speech in Atlanta called the Compromise Speech, in which he had advocated that what black Americans should do is they should quit complaining, in a sense, and just get to work. That they should try to make themselves the most educated and accomplished people that they could possibly be. By doing this, then they would win the respect of white people, who would eventually then choose to treat them as equals. Toward accomplishing this sort of thing, he founded the Tuskegee Institute, an educational institute where black men could go and learn proper skills to get jobs in industry, in the trades. They could learn what they needed to know to get good careers, to make money, to improve their lives. This is an example of his attitude of let's just go work hard, get our own house in order, make ourselves the best people we can possibly be, and then that will fix things. On the other side of this argument was a man named W.E.B. Du Bois. He wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk, in which he challenged the ideas of Booker T. Washington. He thought that blacks should not have to wait to be treated better, that they should implicitly as human beings be treated better. He emphasized the difficulties that they were enduring under the current system and its immorality that needed to be changed now, rather than waiting for some magical day in the future when people would just decide that it was time to honor their place as properly equal humans. He advocated for organizations like the NAACP that would actively stand up and challenge the status quo of Jim Crow. He ended up becoming the editor of the NAACP newspaper called The Crisis. The important thing to remember about this is that we have these two competing visions. One is much more active and aggressive, challenging the system directly, trying to appeal to morality to change it now rather than waiting for later. That's W. Du Bois' point of view. Booker T. Washington's point of view was don't make enemies, don't rock the boat. Prove that we are the kind of people that they should like, and then eventually they will. These two competing visions still compete in America today. And W.E. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington's are the great symbols of them during this time period. And that's an end of this lecture about Chapter 20 in American Yawp.